How do we resist the continued onslaught of imperialism? At that time we called neo-colonialism. We differed, we argued a lot, but on one thing we were very consistent, Ibbo, if you correct me if I'm wrong, on our anti-imperialism. Now I know words like imperialism and capitalism have become four-letter words these days. They are not uttered that simply. So Horace and Ibbo, Horace Campbell, Ibbo Mandaza, belong to that generation. Both of them have taught at this university. And some of you, particularly young lecturers, may remember them. Ibbo was in exile in Tanzania because the Zimbabwean struggle was over, was going on. And when Zimbabwe got its independence or liberated itself, Ibbo went back to Zimbabwe and I think was one of the prime founders of Institute of Development Studies in Zimbabwe. And since then has continued his intellectual work by providing, for example, the SAPES Dialogue Forum, and also printing and writing. And one time he was the publisher of a magazine called SAPEM, in which many of us wrote. It was a very interesting forum because it was not an academic journal on the one hand, nor a simple magazine on the other. It was something in between. And it provided us with a great forum. Horace has been a prolific writer, but not prolific in the sense of writing many things. There are lots of people who write many things, but what do they write? Horace has been writing things which have opened up our insights into many issues. I really enjoyed reading your book on Libya, and one of the few books which will tell you the real story of what happened in Libya. Horace is a very active person, intellectually, and also in terms of liberation of Africa. I don't know if I said it, but let me repeat it if I did not say it, that we belong to that Pan-Africanist generation. I don't know whether we were the last Pan-Africanist generation. Because these days I don't hear much about Pan-Africanism. Our states and political leaders have made sure that Pan-Africanism vision and agenda has put on the back burner. And Rekaza, when we started this chair, one of the ideas was to revive Pan-African debates, Pan-African vision. Before I call upon our presenters to present it, I want to add and acknowledge, and very happily acknowledge the presence of my very close friend, Adebayo Olukoshi. We fondly call him Bayo. And Bayo has more than one thing to his credit. Bayo was the first one through Codesria to support this chair and the idea of this chair. Without that, we would have fallen into the trap of getting funding from funders, development partners, who always come with their agenda. But we were able to establish this chair independently. And actually, we refused funding from corporate bodies or from outside bodies. And that was made possible to a very large extent by Bayo through Codesria. Codesria is a Pan-Africanist organization. And one of the two forums in which we have been debating, Codesria and SAPES Regional Forum. Vijana wenzangu, na furaha kubwa sana kuwatambulisha wazee vijana wenzangu hapa. Hao pamoja na mimi ni wa kizazi kile cha mara baada ya uhuru, tuliokuwa tumejikita kwenye umajumui wa Afrika na mapambano dhidi ya ubeberu. Sasa nikitamka neno ubeberu, wengi wenu labda hamwezi mkakumbuka, au mnaweza kusema huyu mzee anazungumza nini, amepita na wakati, hatuna ubeberu. Sawa, kama mnafikiri hakuna ubeberu, mtaonja uchungu wa ubeberu, mtaonja, hatuko mbali sana. Hawa wazee kwa kweli, kama nilivyosema, walijikita kwenye, sio kwa maandishi tu, lakini pia kutokana na vitendo vyao katika swala nzima la tunataka kujenga Afrika ya aina gani. Tunataka kujenga nchi zetu huru, nchi ambazo zitajitegemea, sio kujitegemea kiuchumi tu, lakini kujitegemea kifikra. Kwa kwetu katika vyuo vikuu ni muhimu sana swala hili. Tujiulize kwa kiasi gani tunajitegemea kifikra. Sio tuna meza tu yale yote tunawaambiwa. Na huwezi ukajitegemea kifikra kama hakuna mijadala katika taasisi zenu za elimu. Kama mnawafundisha wanafunzi wenu, vijana wenu kukariri tu, kuto kukubali kuhojiwa, mnazima mijadala. Wale wanaoanzisha mijadala mnawaambia wachochezi, hamwezi mkajiendelea kifikra. Kwa maneno hayo machache, napenda niwakaribishe wenzangu. With these few words, I would like to invite you to make your presentation. Who is going first? Ibbo. Horace has decided that you are going first. So, by the way, this is being live streamed, and in the course, so maybe we may be joined by some other people. Asante. Ibbo, please.
Asante, Isa. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, my brother and fellow colleague in the Department of Politics, Mukandala, Professor Mukandala. When I received your invitation, I was telling my family that it was like, I felt like a child going to a birthday party. That's how I took this very seriously. I am so grateful, especially Tanzania, as Isa has indicated, is a second home to many of us. I'm not that old, but I was married 43 years ago in Kinondoni. Kutoka Kinondoni. And I'm also pleased that our chair, Isa Shivji, represents the kind of stuff that I'll be speaking about. The anti-imperial struggle, the struggle against the pathologies of the post-colonial, the struggle for Pan-Africanism. Indeed, these are the themes in my paper today. My paper, at the head of my paper, I have 3 quotations which are meant to illustrate, and I want to congratulate the organizers for the title. The title of my presentation is African Liberation, Complete but Unfinished. I couldn't think of a more apt title. At the beginning of the paper, I cite Nkrumah's statement on the 6th of March 1957. I quote, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with total liberation of the African continent." That was the dream of both Mwalimu and Nkrumah. Then my second quotation is from Fanon, Treasure of the Earth, on the pitfalls of national consciousness, the betrayal of the struggle by our class. And he calls us lazy, crude. But the one which is most touching is one from Joshua Nkomo in 1985. "The hardest lesson of my life has come to me late. It is that a nation can win freedom without its people becoming free." Very profound. And to resonate with the Pan-Africanist, I have a dream. I have a quotation from one of our outstanding Pan-Africanist leaders, youth, Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. And it's a quotation from a book edited by Adebayo Olukoshie. And I quote, "We are both others abroad and still others in Africa. Do we not deserve a place to call ours, where we can enter or leave without hindrance? We may never quite be Nigerians, South Africans, or Kenyans, Chadians, or any of the possible colonially induced artificial creations. But at least we can be who we are, Africans. And African citizenship will restore to all of us what is naturally ours." The title of that postcard is "For an Africa of Free, Equal, and Dignified Citizens." The first part of my paper is on African liberation. Mwalimu's legacy, the University of Dar es Salaam, the heady, the rough, but era of hope. I'm glad and immensely grateful to be associated with this auspicious event to mark the centenary of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, whose tenure in public office coincided with the heady but hopeful era of the struggle for national independence in Africa, especially that to which Nkrumah refers, the liberation of Southern Africa. It is an era which also coincides with the development of the University of Dar es Salaam, the Hill, as a center and crucible of the best of African scholarship that the continent has produced so far. An institution that grew and thrived along with the liberation struggles in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. So while we honor and venerate our Mwalimu on an occasion that marks his centenary, so too do we salute the University of Dar es Salaam, whose history is almost synonymous with Tanzania itself, the bastion of African liberation, the rear guard of the struggle itself, the home of the OAU's Liberation Committee, and the chair of the frontline states. In this regard, the last stage of anti-colonial struggle also represents the hope of a better Africa, against the background of a deep disenchantment with post-independence era that had become a nightmare for the majority of Africans. for the independence honeymoon had been so short-lived in the 60s. In less than a decade since the historic speech of 6 March 1957, Nkrumah had been deposed in 1966, as coups and counter-coups became the norm across West Africa. While in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba was brutally assassinated on 17th January 1961, within months of the country's Independence Day in September 1960. And in general, even political independence itself appeared elusive, if not farcical, for most of the 60s and well into the 70s. A post-colonial Africa teeter-tottering in the face of both failure at home and an overarching hold of neocolonialism. In retrospect, Tanzania appeared in those days an exception to what René Dumont cynically described as the false start in Africa. Perhaps this explains why the country and the University of Dar es Salaam became the refuge for liberation movements of Southern Africa. Exiles from Uganda and Kenya, scholars and activists from across Africa and its diaspora. This, says Senegalese scholar and activist Abdoulaye Batili, who also came through this place, that the University of Dar es Salaam was the genesis of liberation scholarship. The frontline states consisted initially of Tanzania, Zambia, and Botswana, but later included Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, reflecting both the advance and success of the struggle, and also Pan-African solidarity across the continent. In this regard, it should not be forgotten that Nigeria was a member of the frontline states of Southern Africa, a key member and benefactor of both the OAU and the Liberation Committee, especially during its oil boom in the days in the 70s and 80s. A significant footnote in this regard, and one which Southern Africans, especially South Africans, should forever remember in relation to the unfortunate incidents of Afrophobia and xenophobia in that country. The fact that Nigerian citizens in 1978 contributed a naira or $1 each, raising more than symbolically to contribute to the armed struggle, millions of dollars. In addition to the enormous flow of resources and support that Nigeria contributed to the struggles in Southern Africa. I was a beneficiary of that as I trekked across from Botswana to Zambia, Tanzania, and to Mozambique. Therefore, the struggle for the liberation of the last portion of Africa, still under white settler colonialism, was a rallying point for Pan-African solidarity across the entire continent. And in this regard, I want just to read a quotation from Albie Sachs, who also taught here with Issa. And he was lamenting the extent to which South Africans have forgotten Tanzania and Mwalimu. Not only was he an exemplary leader with no ambitions to be rich and feared, not only did he offer Tambo extremely valuable advice at crucial moments of our struggle, he also made his country a country with few resources available to the freedom fighters from Southern Africa. He allowed military training to take place there. When I taught at Dar University in 1976, I found myself immersed in the activities of the liveliest law school I've ever been in, Issa. We in South Africa owe so much to Tanzania, yet the name of Julius Nyerere is hardly known here. It was exciting to see student leaders quoting from Fanon, Sankara, but no one spoke about Mwalimu or Nyerere, or Samora Machel, or Augustine for the matter. What can we do to remedy this? I know I should be answering the question, not asking it, but at least posing as a start. That's from R.B. Sachs. So the University of Dar es Salaam itself symbolizes, I keep emphasizing, symbolizes Pan-Africanism throughout this period. With Tanzania and the university in particular became an attraction for radical scholars from across the continent. These scholars and activists, many of them persona non grata in their home countries, serve variously and collectively as a veritable contribution to an understanding of the ideological and political profile of the struggle itself. The list of such scholars is both impressive and inexhaustible. It describes the foundation of the African academic community, around which have emerged some of the most significant pillars, such as the African Association of Political Science, APS, which was founded here at the University of Dar es Salaam in 1973. But that group of Pan-African scholars are serving as lecturers and professors. Nathan Shamirira from Zimbabwe, Daniel Abuderi from Uganda, Yash Tandon, Uganda, Claude Ake, Nigeria, Okudiba Noli, Nigeria, Akisoya, Ghana, Sam Mushi, Tanzania, Justinian and Anthony Rwemamu, Tanzania, and George Nzongola Intalaja, DRC. And as Issa indicated, even SAPES itself was an outgrowth of APS. And indeed, as SAPES, we regard ourselves as an extension of both APS and the University of Dar es Salaam, and including the SAPEM, the magazine, Southern Africa Political and Economic Monthly, to which reference has been made by Issa. So we should also remember that University of Dar es Salaam was a home to such intellectual giants as Walter Rodney. And I see a Walter Rodney here. I was also joking with him yesterday. There's no doubt where the name came from. Archie Mafeje, Ben Magubani, Mahmoud Mamdani, and of course our dear Issa Shivji, the founding member of the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Chair in Pan-African Studies. And Mukandala and I were the juniors in those days, as were Mwesiga Baregu and Ruth Mina. As Issa has just mentioned, the 70s also witnessed the birth of Codestria and Idib, with Abdullah Bujra and Samir Amin at the center of that exercise. And Tandika Mkandawire, Bennett Fonu, Kadmi Atta Mills, Zenta Desi. So both APS and Codestria have become the center or the foundation of the African scholarship. And we have the names Abdullahi Batili, Peter Anyang Nyong'o, Michael Chege, Adel Jinadu, Kwame Ninsen, Emmanuel Hansen, Helmi Sharawi from Egypt, Nzongola, Michere Mugo, Wamba Diawamba, and Horace Campbell Uzia. Another significant development during the Dar es Salaam of the 70s was the occasion in this city of the 6th Pan-African Congress in 1975. And of course, it marked a very important development in that the Pan-African movement had been very quiet for many decades, and also set the foundation for the 7th Pan-African Congress in Kampala in 1994, a most successful Congress for which we must thank Tajuddin, Adebayo Olukoshi, Napoleon Abdullahi, Yao Graham, and of course Abdul Ali Kalmat and our own Horace Campbell. Therefore, the role of African intellectuals in the struggle cannot be exaggerated. They remain the conscience of a continent in transition, punctuating the historical process with amazing insights, not only explaining social reality, but also seeking to change it. And through them, there is this deeper understanding of the nature and content of the state in Africa, the essence of class and all its ramifications, as we heard yesterday from Bayo and Katumai. So, it is for sound reasons, sheer testimony, and I hope I'm speaking accurately about University of Dar es Salaam, that such works by scholars have been not compulsory reading in our universities, but also indelible footprints in the history of scholarship. For example, Fanon, Rachel of the Earth, Achima Feji, Ideology of Tribalism. Samia means unequal development and Eurocentrism. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Peter Onyang Nyong'o and his colleagues in Popular Struggles for Democracy in Africa. Issa Shivji's Silent Class Struggle. Tandika Mkandawire's series, which includes Zimbabwe, The Political Economy of Transition, which I edited. Mahmoud Mamdani's Citizen and Subject. Claude Ake's The Feasibility of Democracy in Africa. And Okudiba Noli's Introduction to Politics. I hope these books are still here, said books. And what about Yash Tanden's The Dar es Salaam Debate? Indeed, these reflect the nature of the debate about the post-independence Africa and how to transform it, but also a demonstration of the intellectual rigor on the part of some of these scholars, like Issa Shivji, without whom African scholarship in general and the University of Dar es Salaam in particular would be difficult to account for. And as Peter Nyang responded a few days ago, I quote, University of Dar es Salaam played a very important role in the development of social science in Eastern and Southern Africa and providing an intellectual home for progressive scholars and students. Not only is it necessary to recall those days and use that experience to critique the vague mission that has emerged in university education in this part of the world, particularly in the social sciences, but also to ensure that history of our intellectual journey is accounted for in our lifetime. And Batili responds, Peter, I cannot agree more with you. A collective book documenting our experience on the Hill, those heroic years would be welcomed by the few remaining pioneers, and more importantly, by the veterans of the struggle and younger generations of scholars. It is important, it's an important chapter of the African liberation history. There is a challenge for Professor Mkandala and his team. This is why, I'm speaking to the university students here, this is why the subject of development studies, is it still here, Professor? One in which every student at the University of Dar es Salaam had to take compulsory, is so legendary in that it sought to expose all to the social sciences while imbuing a political consciousness so essential to Pan-Africanism and transformation. Sincerely, I'm glad to hear that the development studies is still here. We tried it. It influenced many of us, but of course, as Issa mentioned, IDS was unceremoniously dumped and closed, victim of the vagaries of post-independence. So if the 80s were exciting times, I mean the 70s, the 80s were not a good. And the 80s receded into mixture of diffidence, indifference, and even despair about the African condition. Namely, the reality that, notwithstanding the formal end of colonialism, African liberation is as complete as it is unfinished. And the apparent irony that it is precisely in those countries of Southern Africa, especially Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa, who wage an armed struggle in which liberation is most incomplete. In the glaring disparity between, on the one hand, the ceremonial trappings of national independence that include a black majority-led state, a flag and anthem, and on the other, an economy characterized by the continuities and the inequalities of white state colonialism. It includes the unresolved land question, and in the case of South Africa and Namibia, the prevalence of white racism, as much in attitude as in conduct. And in this regard, even Zimbabwe is not yet out of the woods. Therefore, I believe that we should not talk about African liberation. I think it's more correct to talk about post-independence, post-colonial. Both are no less problematic conceptually, but they assist in highlighting the key factors that render African liberation incomplete so far. And there are two issues that I want to highlight. The first is the history of post-colonial Africa and the state which the peasant bourgeoisie inherited independence. What I call the bourgeois state without the national bourgeoisie. The requisite paraphernalia to gird it in terms of its European antecedent. Yet it is on the basis of that model that the post-colonial state has to be assessed in the first instance, particularly the democratic deficit, the vision of a democratic society in which the violations and denials of the colonial era would be a thing of the past and a new meritocracy established. As Claude Ake reminded us, the language of the nationalist movement was the language of democracy, as is clear from I speak of freedom, Nyerere, without bitterness, Oruzi, facing Mount Kenya, Kenyatta, not yet Uhuru, Odinga, freedom and development, Nyerere, African socialism, Senghor, and the richer of the earth, Fanon. It denounced the violation of dignity of the colonized, racial discrimination, lack of equal opportunity and equal access, and economic exploitation of the colonized. The people were mobilized according to these grievances and expectations of a more democratic dispensation, which has been elusive, as I said earlier on. So more than half a century into post-independence, Africa as a whole has demonstrated a glaring economic and political incapacity to fulfill this vision. Unlike the bourgeois state, after which model it is in pursuit, the African state, the African nation state in the making lacks the economic foundations and the anchor class through which to inher a commendable level of national confidence, project national interest, and create a national economy. Hence, the continued hegemony of parasitic and comprador classes, most of whose members have grown pari passu the post-colonial economic pathology and are largely dependent upon the state, international capital, or an institutionalized aid regime. This is the import of the class that Fanon spoke about, a point highlighted by Amilcar Cabral about the petty bourgeois class. And what's important here is to highlight some of the excesses of post-independence. And I want to quote from William Mutunga, a brilliant satire of the post-independence era, the big man syndrome, and the commensurate subversion of national institutions, including a captured judiciary, a lame legislature, and an unaccountable executive. I quote, "His face is on money. His photograph hangs in every office in his realm. His ministers wear gold pins with tiny photographs of him on the lapels of their pinstriped tailored suits. He names streets, football stadiums, hospitals, and universities after himself. He carries a silver inlaid ivory rungu, or an ornately carved walking stick, or a fly whisk, or chiefly stool. He insists on being called doctor, or the big elephant, or the number one peasant, or nice old man, or the national miracle, or the most popular leader in the world. His every pronouncement is reported in the first page. He shuffles ministers without warning, paralyzing policy decisions as he undercuts pretenders to his throne. He scapegoats minorities to show up popular support. He bans all political parties except the one he controls. He rigs elections. He emasculates the courts, and he cows the press. He stifles academia. He gives the church. The big man's off-the-cut CAF remarks have the power of the law. He demands thunderous applause from the legislature when ordering far-reaching changes in the Constitution. He blesses his home region with highways, schools, hospitals, housing projects, irrigation schemes, and a presidential mansion. He packs the civil service with his tribesmen. His enemies are harassed by youth wingers from the ruling party. His enemies are detained or exiled, humiliated, tortured, or killed. End of quote. And so we have seen in my country the development of what we call the securocrat state, which, as I explained elsewhere, is really reflects the militarism of the struggle era, where, and of course, the second factor is the national question. And in this regard, I think we have enough examples, and Tanzania is one good example, where we heard the other day how Mwalimu abolished chieftainship. And by contrast, many of our countries, that has been sustained a colonial institution in the interest of the state. The second last part of my thing, as I conclude, is the neo-colonialism and the role of the petty and comprador bourgeoisie. And I just two quotations, one from Nkrumah and the other from Nyerere. The reality of neo-colonialism quickly becomes obvious to a new African government which tries to act in economic matters in the interest of national development and for the betterment of its own masses. For such a government immediately discovered that it inherited the power to make laws, direct the civil service, to treat with foreign governments and so on, but did not inherit effective power over economic developments in its own country. Indeed, it often discovers that there is no such thing as a national economy. Neo-colonialism is real, end of quote. And Nyerere, speaking in the University of Zimbabwe in 1985, I was there, fortunately, also explains that neo-colonialism expresses itself through the very factors, namely economic, political, strategic, human, and so forth, which accompanied colonization. And I quote Nyerere, "The evidence is all around us. The gap between African poverty and the wealth of the developed nations gets larger. African nations get further into debt and have less and less ability even to sustain such economic progress as they had earlier made. Then when the natural disasters or drought or flood strike, or when indebtedness becomes extreme, the quid pro quo for temporary relief is liable to be facilities for military or communication units of a great power, or the forced adoption of the economic process. And if an African nation is not sufficiently cooperative, then the lessons of Angola and of Libya are there to see, to say nothing of the more subtle and camouflaging interventions in our political systems, which are frequent." And the last point I want to make really is that, well, in the 80s and 90s, we tended to speak of neo-colonialism either from an abstract point of view or as attributable only to the colonialists. I think what has happened in the last 20 years is the role of what I call the comprador bourgeoisie. The people who don't work, the people who have waxed rich from backhanders and so on and so forth. You know, in my country, you heard about $15 billion from diamonds disappearing, and so it goes on. And therefore, in conclusion, how to reform and transform the state, how to restore, as Issa has just indicated, Pan-Africanism. That really is the point. And I want just to end off with this quotation from my lecture, the Steve Biko lecture in 2017. There is the inescapable conclusion that the African nationalist era, inclusive of the national liberation movements, have long served their purpose as the agency for the attainment of political independence and or the formal end of apartheid, and no more. It's a class project. It is both historically preempted and ideologically constrained from taking us further than we've come so far. More than that, it has turned out to be a naive, if not self-indulgent and downright presumptuous, to have expected that this class of leaders that inherited state power could have served us as the anticipated vanguard, the substitute for the national bourgeoisie, through which to drive the national development agenda and enhance the fortunes of the nation state in the making. It is an understatement to conclude that the post-liberation phase so far has been a resounding failure, especially on the economic front. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ibbo, for completing your lecture, although I know it remains unfinished, but we'll finish it during discussion time. Horace, please.
I'm Jambo. Good afternoon, everybody. And I want to send greetings to all those who are joining us from near and far. I would like to continue the discussion that Ibbo has started. And of course, I want to thank the Mwalimu Nyerere Chair Kigoda, my colleague, my younger colleague in the Department of Political Science, Dr. Mukandala, and the team that worked so hard to bring us here and to organize this important festival. I want to thank you, and I want to acknowledge the presence of so many of you, especially Wakijana, Bado Hai. I know yesterday some of you were sleeping, and I know that you weren't following in English, but I'm going to try to speak slowly so you can follow. So thank you for coming. I also want to acknowledge some of my students who I taught here. There are some of them who are here. They have approached me, and I am very pleased to see how successful you have become, because you are from a successful university and a very successful place. And it is important that we are celebrating Mwalimu Nyerere. My presentation is Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and African Liberation. So I want to acknowledge all of you who are here, and especially our brothers and sisters in the front row. As they say in Nigeria, all protocols observed. This festival is here to celebrate the victories of African liberation. And we want to underline victories. But this festival is also here to recognize the work of Julius Nyerere. So we are here to recognize the importance of what Nyerere was fighting for. How can African peoples live in peaceful, secular, and prosperous societies? That is a challenge for us. And one of the things we benefit from, the Tanzanian peoples and the Tanzanian society, is this society has been at peace. And there are many books about Nyerere, many books, many articles, and our brother Issa Shivji Said Othman, and our son Kamata, is he here? They've produced this wonderful volume on Nyerere. So this volume on Nyerere has helped us to understand the relationship between Nyerere and the Tanzanian society. And in celebrating Nyerere, we're not here to deify him. We're not here to worship him, but we're here to place him in the context of the Tanzanian society. And when you look at this 9-volume study on African liberation, it's not only Nyerere that we're thinking of. We're thinking of all of those peoples of Tanzania who form the foundation of Tanzanian support for liberation. We cannot talk about liberation in Tanzania without talking about Hashim Bita and the work that was done by the OAU Liberation Committee. Salem Ahmed Salem and the work he did on the international stage. Ahmed Abdul Rahman Babu and others. And Abdallah. Many would not know that when you're speaking about liberation movements, living and working in communities such as in Mazimbu, in Morogoro, that the ability of the liberation movements to be able to work and live in security depended on the peasants, the working peoples, and the party structures, the intelligentsia. So the Tanzanian people supported liberation. So we're not talking about liberation only coming from Nyerere. We're talking about Nachingwea. I went to Nachingwea 10 years ago because it's such an important historical place in the history of Africa. And when you look at the infrastructure of Nachingwea, the British had set up this infrastructure for the groundnut scheme. Very good infrastructure. The Tanzanians turned that away from the British and turned it over to the liberation movement. So I want to draw from that history of the Tanzanian people and go back to Nyerere's views of liberation. Nyerere had 4 points of liberation. Can you go back once? Liberation for Nyerere, you could look at all of his writings. First, freedom from colonialism and white minority rule. And that's what Ibbo said in his discussion. Are we free from colonialism? It is unfinished because we still have colonial territories in Africa. So we cannot be talking about African liberation today without saying that we still stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Western Sahara, our brothers and sisters in Ceuta, our brothers and sisters in Mayotte. And I think we are not paying sufficient attention to the way in which Mayotte is being used as a base for counter-revolution, counter-insurgency, and destabilization. And it's right here off the coast of Tanzania. So Nyerere said, there are 4 aspects of liberation. First, freedom from colonial rule. Second, freedom from external economic domination. Third, freedom from poverty, injustice, imposed on Africans by other Africans. Ibbo talked about that. Injustice imposed by Africans on other Africans. And fourth, liberation involves mental freedom. When I teach in the university, I say to the students, what is the theoretical framework that we're using for understanding a subject? And if NYERERE is talking about mental freedom, what is the basis on which we'll get this mental freedom? And the basis on which we'll get that mental freedom is based on emancipatory politics. Emancipatory politics, next slide please. Emancipatory politics is very simple and straightforward. Number one, African people think and Africans are human beings. Fundamental. We cannot discuss liberation without an emancipatory framework that humanizes the African, because since the beginning of racial capitalism, the African has been dehumanized and became a non-human. So our education process, the real reason for society is how to humanize the African, and in the process you will humanize the planet Earth. So the ideas that we start from for emancipation is that African people think that the politics must be based on the orality, orature, and popular participation in politics, collective leadership, politics of inclusion. I will not go through all the points. But the theoretical framework for emancipatory politics have 9 elements. Emancipatory politics and the liberation of African women, defending the natural and human resources of Africa, security of the producers, and the cooperation of democratic states and societies in Africa. Africa cannot be free and emancipated as Tanzania. Africa will only be free and emancipated in a unified Africa. So the epistemological framework for African liberation is based on the thinking African and the African knowledge system. You cannot be thinking about African liberation and African freedom on the basis of Hobbes or Locke or Plato or a European ideas that is based on white supremacy, domination of a nature, patriarchy, whiteness, and private property. It must be on the basis of a body of ideas that came out of Africa, which is fundamental to life, which is African fractals. Fractal thinking. Fractal thinking is about the interconnectedness of human beings, about the relationship between humans and nature, and between the spiritual world and the material world. So the thinking that informs emancipatory politics is the thinking that will give us freedom. So when we talk about liberation, we're talking about how do we mobilize African knowledges? How do we mobilize African knowledges and bring that together as a foundation and bring the best of human knowledge from all parts of the world? But the foundation must be the starting point of humanity. Where did humanity begin? Where? Okay. So which knowledge we must start with? Okay. So that's the starting point of liberation. How do we emancipate ourselves? And of course, I come from the society that has produced the greatest theoretician for emancipatory politics. And some of you know him. His name is Bob. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. I teach a course on Bob Marley as a philosopher, because Bob Marley is much more important than John Locke. So the rejuvenation of Africa is what we want to talk about. The rejuvenation of Africa, and my presentation is here to celebrate the victory of Africa in defeating white racism and apartheid. And so my presentation is based on celebrating Kutukonavale. I'm not going to ask these questions. How many of you know about Kutukonavale? How many? We have 500 persons in this room. And the biggest battle in Africa that brought about the freedom for Southern Africa, it is not taught in our schools. Because the idea of African liberation is a gift. When Britain granted independence to Tanzania, when Britain granted independence to Kenya. So Kutukonavale, which was a turning point for African freedom and liberation, is not taught. It's not a reference point. So I want Kutukonavale to be our reference point. So the rejuvenation of Africa at home and abroad. Number one, the military defeat of the South African army of Kutukonavale. Number two, the coming to power of the liberation movements all across Southern Africa. Number three, truth and reconciliation as the foundation of politics. A lot of things wrong with truth and reconciliation, but it provides a basis for bringing new elements in politics. Number four, the World Conference Against Racism and centralizing reparations and reparative justice as a foundation for the future of politics. We cannot talk about politics in the future without dealing with reparations or reparation justice. Then we have the birth of the African Union with all its limitations, but we must celebrate it and build it and fertilize it. And of course, the most dynamic aspect of the revitalization of Africa today is the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement internationally is the new intergenerational, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multiracial, led by the radical grassroots women in all parts of global Africa. And these are aspects of the rejuvenation of the African liberation process that we must celebrate. So we're moving on now to how do we talk about Kutukonavale. Let me say quickly what happened in Kutukonavale. Kutukonavale in 1987 to 1988 was the biggest battle that took place on African soil since the Battle of Alamein in 1942 in Libya. And we diminish African liberation by talking about the Cold War. There was no Cold War in Southern Africa. There was no Cold War in the Congo. It was very hot. Millions of people died in this war. So talking about Cold War is to reduce the African liberation struggle as a subsidiary struggle between what is so-called East-West struggle. Next slide, please. So where's Kutukonavale? Kutukonavale is in Angola. It's in the province of Kudakombango, southeast of Luanda. Next slide, please. And as Fidel Castro said, the history of Africa will be that of before Kutukonavale and after Kutukonavale. Because, please, the history of Africa will be written as that of before Kutukonavale. No, for most people in the liberation movements in South Africa, Kutukonavale did not happen. Because what happened is that United States and Cuba negotiated freedom. And so the active mobilization politically, economically, diplomatically, in all fields to bring about the defeat of apartheid did not take place. Next slide, please. Next one, please. So Nelson Mandela acknowledged that the idea of white supremacy, the idea of the invincibility of white people, was defeated at Kutupalong Valley militarily. Next slide, please. I want to read from Walter Rodney. Because in Europe, every child that goes to school would have learned about Normandy and why Normandy was important in the defeat of fascism. Most schoolboys would have learned about these battles. But we don't teach about Kutupalong Valley because, as Adebayo said yesterday, we don't want our children to have confidence in themselves and have confidence in their history. And to have confidence in yourselves means that you must know your own history. Kutupalong Valley was the end of a long line of battles, from the battles in Zambia. Many people do not know the support that Tanzania gave to Zambia for independence. Many do not know of the support that Tanzania gave to Kenya for independence. I want to refer you to a very small article by Walter Rodney called Mau Mau in Tanzania, about the peasants and workers in Moshi giving assistance to the Land and Freedom Army in Kenya. So, long before the OAU Liberation Committee, there was a Pan-African movement for Eastern and Central Africa that mobilized support through the Bureau of African Affairs of Ghana. And then after the All African People's Conference in 1958, then we have PAFMECA, and they supported Zambia, supported Mozambique. The high point of liberation in this region was the fall of the Portuguese fascist regime. The fascist regime in Portugal did not just fall, they were defeated militarily, politically, and diplomatically. And it was from these dusty streets in Dar es Salaam, in liberation camps, that the liberation movements got their support. The liberation of Angola, the liberation of Zimbabwe, and the independence of Namibia. Now, what has happened about Kutupalong Valley and this support that Tanzania gave? The World Bank had to diminish Tanzania. You listen to the statement that Albie Sachs made, that Ibbo Mandaza read. In South Africa, international capital spent $1 billion to say that you should not follow Tanzania because Tanzania is a failed state. Nyerere is a flawed leader. And so members of the liberation movements themselves in South Africa do not teach people in South Africa about the sacrifices of the Tanzanian peoples, the Tanzanian government, and Tanzanian society to liberation. So the intellectual leadership and intellectual work is taken over by the Boers who says, yes, this was done for negotiations. Chester Cocker wrote a very long book of over 500 pages to say, high noon in southern Africa, keeping peace in a rough neighborhood. And that the United States was keeping peace and was negotiating. The United States was a competent. The World Bank and the IMF supported apartheid. So, next slide, please. So this $1 billion investment went into NGOs. Now, one thing about writing about Kutupalong Valley is that there are alternative narratives. The Cubans, who made the biggest sacrifice in Angola for the defeat of Kutupalong Valley, they opened up their archives. Now, there's a very, very big book on Kutupalong Valley by an Italian professor in the United States of America. But the problem with that book is about the victory in Kutupalong Valley, but the book, the subtitle of the book is Pretoria, Moscow, and Havana. In other words, the peoples of Africa who did the diplomatic, political, military work had nothing to do with Kutupalong Valley. But can you blame them if we don't teach Kutupalong Valley in the Department of Political Science at the University of Dar es Salaam? Can you blame them if we don't take our own archives to do this work? Next slide, please. So, Tanzania was the anchor of liberation. And we want to teach our young people about this work. Let me move on to the next issue. What was the anchor of liberation in Tanzania? The anchor of liberation in Tanzania was the Arusha Declaration and Ujamaa. You cannot speak about liberation in Tanzania without speaking about Ujamaa. Ujamaa was based on the strength of the village community, the knowledge of the village community, and the promise of how to organize a new society based on the legacies of cooperation. In Kiswahili it is called Utu. In South Africa it's called Ubuntu. It is the idea that I am a person because you're a person and your humanity depends on my humanity. But the Ujamaa culture, Ubuntu, could not develop with the ideas of liberal capitalism, which is based on development. I want to repeat that. Because this morning we're talking about teaching Kiswahili. And we're talking about teaching Kiswahili in physics and in mathematics. But it's not enough to teach Kiswahili in mathematics and physics if we're going to teach Euclidean geometry and teach the physics of Isaac Newton, unless we're teaching the physics of the 21st century, unless we're teaching the physics can free our people, unless we're teaching the physics that brings us into the future. That's what this conference is about. Reflections on the present and the future. There's a black woman who wrote this important book that I want to bring to your attention. She's an astrophysicist. The Disordered Cosmos, a journey into dark matter, space, time, and dreams deferred. Radical black women are taking all of the ideas of patriarchy and physics. So where does this idea of dark matter come from? And I recommend this to you, especially those of you who are studying physics. I not only recommend that you study fractals, because what Ujamaa can make possible in the digital era is a quantum leap beyond the linearity of liberal capitalism or a Marxism which is based on phases of development, which is not based on the transformation of the conditions of the lives of the people. Let me move on to the next area of liberation of Nyerere. Let me move on. I was going to read this quotation, but you all know it. Please go back to that quotation for me. NYERERE'S quotation. We have been oppressed a great deal. We have been exploited a great deal. And we have been degraded a great deal. It is our weakness. Yes? It is our weakness that has led us to being oppressed and disregarded. Now we want a revolution. Asimio. NYERERE say you cannot have a revolution, you cannot have Ujamaa without a revolution. Now we want a revolution which brings an end to our weakness, that we're never again exploited, oppressed, and humiliated. But this could not be done under the conditions of that time. And that's why NYERERE understood that the liberation of Tanzania was tied up to the liberation of Africa, of the non-aligned world, and the global South. And NYERERE went on to become the chairperson of the South Commission. I was born in Jamaica, nimezaliwa Jamaica, lakini sasa mimi in Tanzania. I want to make a comparison between Jamaica and Tanzania in the non-aligned world. Because Michael Manley attempted to oppose imperialism without changes in the Jamaican society and harmonizing the ideas of the Jamaican society to face imperialism. And Jamaican society was destroyed by the World Bank and the IMF. We have to bear that in mind. Now let's go to the question of the South Commission. The South Commission. Today, we're talking about the future. NYERERE, understanding that liberation in Africa must be linked to the liberation of the planet Earth, worked on the South Commission, and Adebayo spoke about his work with NYERERE in the South Commission. I would urge you to read the findings of that South Commission, because that South Commission brought us to where we are today with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Most people do not know about RCEP. The most comprehensive economic relations in the world today, bringing about the largest trading bloc in the world, is the RCEP. And the intellectual anchors of the RCEP are Vietnam and Indonesia. Next slide, please. So the RCEP, they have cut themselves off from the IMF and the World Bank. They've created institutions in Asia so they do not have to go to the IMF and the World Bank. The Chiang Mai Initiative means that they pool their resources in Asia not to go to the World Bank and the IMF. And they oppose the World Bank and the IMF in Asia. And now they've brought together China, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand to have the largest trading bloc in the world. Of course, if you follow the American media, they say it's a Chinese-led RCEP. China is actually the weak link in the RCEP because the social science is so underdeveloped in China itself. Next slide, please. Let me move to the conclusion. NYERERE was a champion of fighting the IMF and the World Bank and their ideas. When they came up with this program, highly indebted poor countries, or the debt cancellation, today we have moved beyond that, because it is now clear that racial capitalism was a criminal enterprise that carried out crimes against African people and against the whole world. And in the question time, I can go to the genealogy of racial capitalism. But in the Caribbean, the popular movement in the Caribbean has brought about the global reparations movement for reparative justice. Now, reparations is a very wide church. Some people say the British and the Americans must pay money. So the Caribbean reparations plan involved, number one, full apology. That is, the British, the Americans, the Europeans must say, we committed crimes. Number two, repatriation. Caribbean people say they have the right to go back to Africa. Number three, indigenous peoples development. We cannot talk about changing our lives in that part of the world without acknowledging the genocide against the First Nation peoples. Number four, cultural institutions. Number five, public health crisis. The health crisis that we have, the organization of the health system is linked to enslavement. Number six, illiteracy. African Knowledge Program. Again, go back to African knowledge. Psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, and debt cancellation. That's the reparations program. So the liberation project of the future involves reparations, reparative justice, linking the South, and to our last point, the unification of the peoples of Africa. Nyerere understood, next slide please. Nyerere understood, and I'm going to end here. You cannot talk about the future of Tanzania outside of the future of a unified Africa. It is a fiction to think that you can have development in Tanzania. Doesn't mean that Tanzania is going to stand still. It's a two-track process. That the consolidation of peace and independence in Tanzania will only be accelerated with the unification of Africa. Unity will not end our weakness, but until we unite, we cannot even begin to end that weakness. So this is my plea to the new generation of African leaders and African peoples. Work for unity with a firm conviction. Without unity, there is no future for Africa. That is the message I want to leave with you. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya. The subtitle of the book, Lessons for Africa in the Forging of African Unity. I took the ideas of Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, all of those, Wangari Maathai, who were fighting for African unification, to say that the NATO destruction of Libya was a turning point in the world. So yes, here we are now. We have reached that turning point. Because the war in Ukraine is brought fundamental changes to the world. And as African peoples, we must not only pay attention to this war, but we must understand that this war is unleashed because of the weaponization of everything by United States military. Let me repeat. The weaponization of trade, the weaponization of food, weaponization of energy, the weaponization of currency. And in fact, the war, the foundation of this war is to save the United States dollar. So, what will Africa's response be to the food crisis, to the energy crisis, to the political crisis, the balance of payments crisis? Is it to go back to the same World Bank that have the military management of the international system to save the United States dollar and to repeat their shibboleths, or to move towards the unification of the peoples of Africa so we can learn from Nyerere? Julius Nyerere was a great human being. And the struggle for African liberation is a struggle for our humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Horace. I think that lecture by Horace Campbell puts our struggles in a perspective which you do not hear much these days. I particularly would like to emphasize the way Horace ended, that how do you address the Ukraine crisis? Do you go back to the World Bank? Unfortunately, we are going back to the World Bank. I shall say no more. Just read the news which has come out the last 2 days. Okay, without wasting much time, let us have discussion. Ndugu, tutasaidia kutafsiri, njoo hapa juu. So you may ask your question in Kiswahili or English. We will have our colleague to translate it for Horace and Ibbo. So feel free. This is the little liberated zone we have here. So don't feel constrained. Be as free as you can. So ask your questions, make comments. Keep it short so that we can give opportunity to as many people as possible. Sawa? Tunakubaliana? Tuwe na nidhamu? Sawa? Tuwe na nidhamu. Hatuhitaji hotuba za wanasiasa. Tuachie wanasiasa watoe hotuba. Hapa tunataka mjadala. Okay? Let me start with you. You stretched your hand so hard that I cannot possibly overlook you.
My name is Joram Kumbi. I come from Professor Lumumba Foundation. And my question goes to Dr. Horace Campbell. As I was listening to you, you were like a man shouting in the wilderness, calling the young people to baptism, the baptism of Pan-Africanism. And I can see you have called many to the altars. And behind you, I can see Michere Mugo and Samira Mil. So my question is, capitalism is right here. And people have described themselves as Marxist, Leninist, neoliberalist, trade unionist. I'm interested to know philosophically, who are you among the groups that I've mentioned? And if you will refuse to be described in these levels, again, who are you philosophically?
All right. Who are you? That question we should be asking to all of us. Who are we? Who are we? Okay. Next person there, please. Back, yes. Okay, Asante.
Okay, my name is Zacchaeus Malcolm Mahushi, a university student taking BIT. My question goes to Professor Ibbo. Professor Ibbo, you've just alluded to the fact that the African continent was or has been subjected to colonial imperialism, and that some of the fighters for freedom were subjected to, persecution, like the likes of Patrice Lumumba. And you've concluded by saying that we are facing neocolonialism up to date. Now my question is, what's the antidote for neocolonialism in Africa? Thank you.
Okay. presenters are noting down your questions, and then we have finished the questions, they'll come back to respond. Yes, there.
Okay, thank you. My name is Makala Jonas Musa. I'm here, a student at University of Dar es Salaam, pursuing in Bachelor of Arts in Diplomatic and Military History. I have a few questions. First question, because Tanzania previously has had a huge role in diplomatic relations, especially in Africa and in the world at large. What is the current position of Tanzania in diplomatic and international political affairs in ensuring sustainable development? The second question, we know that Tanzania played a great role towards the liberation on the southern African countries, including Mozambique, which was the first country in Tanzania, its cadres to arrive in 1963. What are the current role of those southern African states towards the development of Tanzania, in all spheres? Thank you.
Here.
Nashukuru. Kwa majina naitwa Monica Mbanus Kihanga. Ninasoma mwaka wa pili Chuo Kikuu cha Dar es Salaam. Nasoma BA in Psychology. Swali langu linaenda kwa Professor. Nilikuwa nataka kujua baada ya kuwa umetuelezea sasa umuhimu wa Mwalimu Nyerere katika liberation and everything. Sasa ni namna gani ambavyo unaweza unatuambiaje like au unashauri vipi serikali yetu au organizations tofauti ambazo zinajihusisha na kufanya uamsho ule wa kufanya uamsho kwetu vijana katika kupelekea kuleta ile spirit ya kuwa I want to know my country, I want to know what Nyerere did for us, and yeah, that's it.
Let me come to my right here. Let's start here. Right there.
Shouldn't I translate that, Prof?
Sorry? Oh, you want to translate?
Or you got it? Yeah. So much as you have presented about all this Nyerere's great contribution towards liberation, what would your advice be in conscientizing the minds of young people in the very spirit of Pan-Africanism and being patriotic? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Hilda Gaspar. I'm real so saddened because when you were talking, Prof, the last one who presented, I was feeling like I don't know anything. It's just the first time I'm hearing what you're saying. So, if you tell me like in Africa, youth, we are complaining about each and everything, I think it's because we don't know anything about us. We are just lost in the wilderness, as the fellow you said, because I remember when I was in secondary school, I was taking all the subjects, including history. And bad luck, the teacher who was teaching history didn't know well the history she was teaching. So I just found myself hating history. So I just didn't understand well, and I didn't like the history. So I just studied to pass the exam, and I did. And I went to take PCB. I did Bachelor of Science in Biology. And now I think I just lost all my time because what I got is not what I was supposed to get. I was supposed to know what I have as a Tanzanian, as African young person. And now you find that like we are looking for economic liberation. How can we look for economic liberation while we don't know even what we have in place? So I think it's maybe if it was the parents, it's now the time to write a will to young people in Africa. Please, we are in the wilderness. We don't know anything. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. The fact that you don't know anything is not a comment on you. It's a comment on us, including Mheshimiwa Pinda hapa. It's a comment on us. Tunakufundisha nini? What are we teaching you? In the schools, in our universities? What are we doing? So, I think you made a very important comment. You made an extremely important comment. And I hope that it will make us think. How was it when you compare? I hope it will make them think. Sawa. Yuma. Okay. Yuma kabisa kule.
Okay. My name is Gibbs Sylvester Joseph. I'm from Benjamin William Cup High School. I have a question to the first speaker. According to one of our quotations that I quote from him, he said that African countries are free, but the people, the natives, aren't free at all. So what I just wanted to know is that what kind of freedom that they want them to be free from? And one among the questions that were asked, according to neocolonialism, as far as to my concern and as far as to my knowledge, I know about colonialism that the state is free, but it's still being colonized. So my question goes to the first speaker, that what are those spheres that we're being colonized in according to economically, politically, and social? So I need to know the categories on where we're heading as the Africans. Thank you.
I'll take two more and then we get some questions from those who are watching it, the live stream, okay? So, I'll take two more. Okay. With a yellow t-shirt, please. Oh, right.
Asante sana. My name is Sami Oscar Mkemwa, and my question will go to the last speaker. In recent history, we have seen that colonialism has brought a number of negative effects in our continent. So, my question is, why are we still celebrating this capitalism until today? Thank you.
Okay. Let me see now. I know you have, okay, let's get you here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Asheri Andrea Malekela. I'm a retired teacher. I'd like to express my views in Kiswahili for a good reason that I want to be clear. Nataka niseme, tunazungumza Pan-Africanism, pia wa Afrika tuweje kujinasua kwenye matatizo tulionayo. Lakini ninaoliona mimi tatizo ni kubwa zaidi. Naweza kusema Marekani alimuua Saddam Hussein akisema ana silaha za maangamizi. Alipokufa hawakuona silaha za maangamizi. Hakuna hatua iliyofanyika na dunia kumsuu Marekani. Amekuja amemuua Gaddafi akisingizia vitu vingine, lakini sababu kubwa ya kumuondoa Gaddafi alikuwa analeta umoja ambao nyinyi ndio mnaozungumza sasa hapa, kwa kufanya benki ya Afrika iweze kukopesha mataifa ya Afrika, tuondokane na benki ya dunia. Walivyogundua hivyo walimuondoa. Wa Libya leo wanateseka, wanapata shida. Hakuna mtu ameuliza chochote Marekani kwa nini walifanya hivyo, akishirikiana na Mwingereza. Ameweza weekend nchi zingine zote duniani. Kwa mfano Urusi ya wakati huo ilikuwa kubwa, alisambaratisha nchi kama Ukraine, ilikuwa ndani ya Urusi. Lakini baada ya Urusi kusambaratika, yeye amemtumia mtu aliyemweka anaitwa Zelensky afanye mambo yake pale chini. Wanatengeneza silaha za maangamizi, lakini lengo ni kuhakikisha wanamsambaratisha Mrusi ili waendelee kutuumiza. Kwa hiyo tunachokizungumza hapa, tunakizungumza katika level ndogo sana. Hata kama tukifanya nini wa Afrika, lakini dunia nzima imeshikwa na Marekani, lazima awe kufikiria nje ya hapo. Yeye Marekani anaadabishwa na nani? Kwa sababu shida yote iliyopo duniani kwa sasa na hata huko nyuma, Marekani yuko nyuma yake. Asante sana.
Okay, sorry, let's come to those who ask questions on the internet.
Okay, thank you very much. We only have 3 questions. This one is from Masato. I'll read it. He says that what we hear is the good history of what Tanzania did for liberation movement of African countries, majorities coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Questions to the presenter and audience. Does Tanzania still hold its respective political position as it used to be during the liberation eras? Is Tanzania still a good example of democracy and freedom in the continent? If not, does the presenter think this comes out of the education that doesn't teach its people about their good history and instill critical thinking skills? Where does the presenter see Tanzania in the coming years? Then, of course, we have the next one from Ngobile Ngwenya. This is directed to Horace, Campell. And he says, I don't hear Horace talk about Chinese imperialism. Are we not too obsessed with Bretton Woods capture, at the same time glorifying Chinese imperialism disguised in multilateral trade agreements? That's to Horace. Thank you.
You want to start, Horace? And then you come to Ibbo?
Okay. Unanja, see you. I'm going to try to be brief. Who am I? I am the beneficiary of the Rastafari movement, the people who said in Jamaica that no African can be free until all of Africa is free. I come from a society where racism and capitalism shaped us, and our understanding of the world was enhanced by great thinkers. Some of the great thinkers who I still learn from are people like Walter Rodney, who was a great thinker, activist, was assassinated for fighting for African freedom and third world freedom. And I want to add to the young people here, we do not support any kind of Pan-Africanism that is based on xenophobia and is based on anti-white or anti-Indian. Issa Shivji will not say this himself. I'm going to say it for him. We will not be part of any Pan-African movement that says that Issa Shivji cannot be part of that movement. Yesterday we had an atrocious paper presented here on Pan-Africanism. And the paper spoke about Pan-Africanism for black people. In other words, this Pan-Africanism is going to exclude people who are deemed non-black, and the people they deem non-black are whites, Arabs, and Indians. That is antithetical to the ideas of Pan-Africanism of Walter Rodney, which is about the unity of peoples, especially working peoples in Africa. So that's the heritage I come from. And I benefit from the people who have carried Pan-Africanism even further. Wangari Maathai. Wangari Maathai has taken Pan-Africanism to the level of the planet Earth. Michere Mugo, who talks about Pan-Africanism of women and youth. So those are the people who I benefit from. And of course, I am very concerned about the young people because of the technologies that are being unleashed to hack the brains of young people. Brain hacking. I think most of you know that Facebook is an instrument of white supremacy. Do they know this? That Facebook is being used to reinforce ideas of white supremacy. So the algorithms of oppression that are being used so that while we are speaking, while Ibbo and I are speaking, you're there looking at your text messages. Because your brain cannot function for 1 hour to follow something that's going on for your benefit. The question about the Tanzanian educational system. I still believe that there's one benefit that Tanzania has from its era of liberation support, and that's a relative level of social peace. And I would ask my brothers and sisters in Tanzania to cherish that. Do not diminish this. Do not poo-poo the fact that you can drive from here down to Dar es Salaam without going through 5 roadblocks with police and soldiers. These are very important traditions of Tanzania. Of course, there are so many problems in Tanzania. But those problems are problems of capitalist exploitation. And they will not be resolved by what they tell you in the World Bank, good governance. The people who need good governance, the number one institution that needs good governance in the world is the IMF and the US military. And they come to talk to you about good governance, human rights, and democracy. Of course, you know that there was an attempted coup in the United States last year. They have a hearing going on right now with this attempted coup. And that coup has not gone away because of the forces there. I don't want to go on about that. I just want to answer the question. To my young sister, there was a vibrant organization in Tanzania called the History Teachers Association. Does it still exist? In name only. I remember 40 years ago, all the teachers who came out of the schools, the syllabus of the History Teachers Association of Tanzania was to ensure that Tanzanians learn the geography of Tanzania. They learn the rivers, the lakes, the trees, the mines of Tanzania. I want to, someone asked, do I still have confidence in Tanzania? I have confidence in Tanzania as I have confidence in Africa. That confidence is based on the fact that we can have this function here called the Mwalimu Nyerere Intellectual Festival. The question for me, are we building on Nyerere's intellectual traditions? Are we building on other people's traditions? Somebody asked a question about sub-Saharan Africa. I don't recognize that question. I've heard that formulation here so many times since I've been in this conference. Where is this place called sub-Saharan Africa? Where is it? And I hear students calling about sub-Saharan Africa. Where is sub-Saharan Africa? Is a racist formulation by the Pentagon and the United States of America to divide Africa. There's only one Africa of the African peoples. They used to call it Black Africa. We do not use formulations called sub-Saharan Africa. The Sahara is a place of unity because the Sahara is a place we have the largest reservoir of water under the Sahara, and we're going to build a canal from the Congo to Lake Chad, 2,400 kilometers, to rejuvenate Lake Chad and to create a canal system to unify Africa. Those who talk about sub-Saharan Africa do not want us to build canals and infrastructure for the unification of Africa. And we can do it because Tanzania and Africa is not poor. Tanzania does not need foreign investment. What Tanzania needs is to retain the money generated in Tanzania by Tanzanians. If you retain that money, Africa has lost $1.3 trillion. The governor of the Bank of Tanzania quoted that figure on Wednesday. We do not teach students about the stolen assets recovery program. We are in the Caribbean, we have a program called the Reparations Movement. The World Bank and the IMF oppose the reparations movement. They've organized with the president of Rwanda to impose a candidate for the Secretary General of the Commonwealth to say the Caribbean should not be carrying forward reparations discussions. And they do not want reparations because reparations said simply that when the King of Belgium went to the Congo this week, the King of Belgium should apologize for killing 10 million Congolese people. But they do not say they killed Congolese people. Belgium brought civilization to the Congo. Let me stop here.
Asante sana. Asante sana. Asante sana. In the pre-Vasco da Gama era, Sahara was to West Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, what Indian Ocean is to the Eastern Africa. That's right. Read history. That's what Sahara was. Sahara was not a dividing factor. Sahara was a uniting factor. And one of the reasons why Gaddafi was overthrown, because he wanted to mine the aquifers of Sahel region to supply water to all that region, while the French Prime President at that time wanted to exploit that water to be exported to the north. Let's read history. Let's get our facts right. Sub-Saharan Africa is very much a colonial, neo-colonial term, which keeps us divided. And this business of good governance that we get from the World Bank, it's a World Bank coinage. In Kiswahili, what do we say siku hizi? Utawala bora. Nani anataka kutawaliwa? Mwalimu hakuzungumzia utawala bora. Mwalimu alizungumza uongozi bora, sio utawala bora. Mimi sitaki kutawaliwa.
I'm sorry. There's one question I didn't answer. I'm sorry. I looked at my notes. Someone in the audience asked about Chinese imperialism. Yeah. And I want us to answer that question. Do the Chinese people who in the past 20 years have been consolidating their reconstruction of their society, do they have the infrastructure for imperialism? In other words, there are many Chinese companies in Africa who are doing very bad things. Why are they doing bad things? Because those Chinese companies are companies that are capitalist organizations that exploit Chinese workers in China. And if they exploit Chinese workers in China, if they come to Africa, they will exploit African workers too. But does that constitute imperialism? What is imperialism? First of all, imperialism does not develop in 20 years. So the Chinese may aspire to be imperialists, but I have a message for them. Capitalism on which imperialism is built is racial capitalism. And racial capitalism will never allow the Chinese to consolidate the economic foundations to make them imperialists. So when they use language of Chinese imperialists, is to cut us off from the solidarity that we must have with the Chinese workers and peasants. I want to repeat that. The Chinese workers and peasants are exploited by the Chinese capitalists. And when these Chinese capitalists come to Africa or to Europe or any other, they exploit people. But imperialism is not an overnight phenomenon. British imperialism was not built solely on the British East India Company. British imperialism was built on the English language, and we had a long discussion this morning about imperialism and the English language in Tanzania. British imperialism was built on Christianity. Let me repeat that. British imperialism was built on Christianity. British imperialism was built on British culture. Language, culture, finance, military, religion. These are the constituent components of imperialism. Are you telling me that Africans fought at Kutukonavale? Africans fought for the past 50 years to fight against Western imperialism, and because some African leaders are corrupt and they signed bad deals with the Chinese have automatically taken over Africa? That is the lack of self-confidence that we have in ourselves. We want Africans to have the self-confidence to say that there'll be no place in the world as powerful, as strong as Africa, and the struggle in the Africa of the Pan-Africanism is to, as we said, to have a peaceful, prosperous, united Africa. Africa has a lot to teach the Chinese. The Chinese do not have clean water. The Chinese do not have clean air. The Chinese working class do not have the autonomy and the cultural autonomy of the African workers. For you to limit yourself and to say the Chinese are imperialists is meaning that you're just throwing up your hands. And you know who's generating that language about Chinese imperialism? The white racists.
Okay.
The white racists in the United States of America and Europe who have bigger enterprises in Africa than the Chinese is telling us, yes, the Chinese is exploiting gold in Ghana. The Chinese is exploiting cobalt in the Congo. The Chinese exploit. Yes, it is true. And we must oppose that. But we must also oppose British and American imperialism.
Thank you. Thank you. There's AFRICOM in Africa. I haven't heard of Chinese com in Africa. AFRICOM, right? Okay, Ibbo?
Just two comments. One is on Tanzania. I think one of the elements of this conference is to relive what we called liberation ideology. And liberation ideology was part of the Tanzanian experience. So Tanzania remains a reference point for most of us. And I think my understanding of this conference is precisely to try and provoke a thinking around that. And I think we have begun well. And I'm not surprised by a young lady who talks about being in the wilderness. It's not you alone. It's an African problem. And that's why I spoke at length about the history of this university and the importance of development studies and how that influenced our teaching across the region. Professor Bayo and I are visiting. I'm a visiting professor and he's a substantive professor there. The experience in South Africa at Wits is worse than the wilderness you spoke about. We have to try and impose the books that I've talked about. I did so deliberately. The said books, which were said books in this country, in the university. And I'm pleading that really we go back to that. We used to, I was external examiner here at IDS, and I saw already in the 80s kind of depletion of that substance that I knew here. And I think we need to repair that so that, as Issa said, this is an indictment on us as teachers. So, Tanzania remains, especially Nyerere's role, a role model about which we as Africans must sustain. And so I'm pleased to be part of this. My last comment really is on the point raised. I made reference in NYERERE'S quotation from Nyerere on the political, economic, social, cultural features which characterize neocolonialism. And I was saying that they're not different from the neo-colonial era. Now, I know Horace has sought to answer this issue of Chinese imperialism. But one thing, I was in a panel discussion last year on the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party, and I asked one question: why do the Chinese come with their industries to Africa, set up industries all over? Why are they behaving exactly as the imperialists? And I asked the question, here, my quotation, what has changed since, in terms of the position of Africa as a supplier of raw materials, especially in the extractive industries? What has changed from what Rhodes said in 1858? And I just want to quote as I end. Rhodes said the following in 1858. I was in the East End of London, a working class quarter, yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, bread, bread. On my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution of the social problem, i.e., in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I've always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialist. Now, there may be conceptual issues in the definition of imperialism, but certainly the features of Chinese activities, especially in the extractive industries, I don't know about here, but in my country, I mentioned the $15 billion from diamonds. Most of that went through the Chinese companies out of the country. So, whether you call it imperialism or not, the point is this: we have a better rapport as Africans with the Chinese. I think there's need for our governments to confront the Chinese, to behave differently from the imperialists. That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of this session, but not to the end of our discussions. Let this be sustained, and let's continue discussing that. Don't reserve your comments, your discussion just to the festival. Continue them. If you're not allowed to continue them in your class, do it outside the class. That's what we did. We started our own classes. Zempinda, unakumbuka? We had ideological classes. Kwa hivyo, continue doing it. Kwa hivyo, kwa niaba ya wanajopo na washukuru sana. I thank you all for this great opportunity. I think this was an absolutely spirited discussion and probably one of the best discussions in the festival, I think. Yes? Am I right? Rukas accepts it. I forced him to accept it. This is one of the best discussions, I think. And this was the original idea of the chair. This exactly was the original idea of the chair. So let's continue discussing. Asante sana, tuwapigie makofi tena.
Asanteni sana. Jamani, hayo makofi hayatoshi. Tuongeze tena. Thank you, professors. It was a very engaging sessions and quite educative to all those of us who are still growing up and learning about these things. So, we are really lagging behind time. And I suggest we break. We have 30 to 35 minutes for lunch. Those with the cards, the VIP, would exit through this door. And those with coupons should exit